Hi everyone, this is Dr. Raquel Butler from Integrated Veterinary Therapeutics.
And Zoe Vandenberg from Equine Postulate. And we welcome you to the Equine Functional Posture Podcast, your ultimate source for insights into the influence of functional posture on biomechanics, health, and overall well-being of horses.
Whether you're a seasoned equestrian, an equine professional, or simply a horse enthusiast, this podcast is designed to help you understand the critical aspects of functional posture.
Tune in each week as we discuss practical tips, delve into expert interviews, and explore the latest research in the impact of functional posture on equine anatomy, physiology, movement, and more.
Let's create a world where we empower our horses to be in a mental, emotional, and physical balance. Hi everyone, this episode is to create tools to utilise pre and post ride, to recognise how your horse is coping with riding, as well as pick up issues earlier. We're specifically looking at the back, as it will give an indication of tension and fatigue in the body, and it will highlight any issues.
So the back is an interesting junction of a lot of different fascial lines, and they extend along the entire body. These incorporate the limbs, and so there's a lot of valuable feedback that you can get there, by looking at the back in relation to whole body function. And so when we are intentional and purposeful in our way of looking at the back, so this means beyond comments of like, the horse is, lacking top line, or, I think he has a sore back, this just means that we get to divide our observations down into easy structured ways of making almost a quantifiable observation that we can use. And it's important to acknowledge that when things appear in the back, this is a window of information that is usually a compensatory issue. And by the time we recognize it, we may already have a horse that is girthy or cold-backed or bucking or has some kind of behavior.
Yeah, and horses shouldn't be cold-backed. You shouldn't have to get on and say, oh, he just takes a little minute to warm up, and then he's fine. That's not how it should be. So if a horse feels a little bit funny and bracy when you first get on, there's an underlying cause for that, and you need to do further investigations into why that's occurring. And also, as Sophie said, the back is an area of connections, and there's so many muscles that run along the back that connect from like the hip and the pelvis all the way to the neck, and through apart from the fascial lines and their connections, but through that back area we have the superficial gluteal, which connects from below the hip, goes through the thoracolumbar fascia to the latissimus dorsi that connects into the medial shoulder, which explains why if there's a limb issue in the hind limb or the forelimb, it's going to create change through that back, because it's going to change the way that that shoulder and hip is moving, and therefore it's going to change the accessibility of motion across the back. So when we want to notice if there's an issue before it actually escalates. We want to notice these earlier signs and work through the possible causes and eliminate them. So we're going to give you some observations that you can do pre-work and post-work. And we're specifically talking about riding here, but you can do this from a groundwork perspective too, except the added value that you have when you're working from the ground is that if they don't have a saddle or a roller on, is you can look at the back during work, which I'm always looking at that. It gives me so much valuable information. But we're assuming that you have something on the back, so you can only look at it pre and post work easily. So pre-work and post-work, you're going to look at the shape, the comfort, the texture and tone of the back muscles, and the function. So with shape, you're going to look at especially the base of the wither. So is it angular or smooth? We want it to be smooth. And does that then flow into the lumbar? Or does the lumbar have an upward curve, which is a roach? Or does it go in a squiggly line? Which I've seen that a few times. The same with anywhere along the back could be going in a squiggly line. And so, do you have, and that could be a squiggly line like upward and downward, or it could be a squiggly line like sideways as well. So you can just look at the shape of your horse's back and just start to ask yourself, is that a nice shape? And does that change pre and post ride? The next thing is the comfort. So actually palpating along the spinous processes, so the middle of the back, and feeling you should be able to press fairly firmly and that they should not dip away from you. And you're just going along quite slowly but fluidly along the top of those spinous processes. You're also looking for lumps and bumps in that comfort and, dipping away. Muscularly, you want to look at the area right beside the spine. So if you just run your hands along there reasonably firmly, do they brace? Do they splint? Is there any obvious signs of discomfort? And then a hand width out from that, more where the outside of the saddle kind of sits, running your hand through that area and feeling for comfort. So you can also do gentle squeezes along the back, along that muscular area to see if we're not trying to drop them.
Okay.
So we're not trying to just come in and squeeze. We're just gentle squeezes. They should be able to be quite comfortable with that. So shape and comfort. What about texture and tone and function?
So when it comes to texture and tone, that's about what the muscle feels like to you. So you were just talking when it comes to comfort about how does the horse respond? Are they going to kind of blink? Are they going to turn and look at you? Are they going to take a sideways step? What kind of response are you going to get from them? Are they sort of going to dip down? Like you said, you're not trying to get them to drip away. But when you talk about texture and tone, that's more what do you actually feel underneath your hands? What does it feel like underneath your fingertips and your palm when you lay them on your horse's back, and what feedback are you getting? And so, you can feel for things like heat. So when you run your hand along, are you going to get the same kind of temperature from the wither pocket area, so just behind the scapula, and you can run your hand flat all the way up across to that lumbosacral junction beside the lumbar vertebra, and that can go down to, sometimes you can do a couple of hand widths all the way along to really inspect the whole space. And as you're doing that, as you run your hand across, again, you don't want to be super firm, but the tone is going to be, does my hand sort of dip into the tissue a little bit, but it doesn't sort of sink in like there's a lot of fat, or that the tissue is very spongy, that it doesn't have any tone when I run across it. You kind of want to have a light bounce underneath your hand. If, there are some backs you run your hand along and you don't fall into them at all, which is on the other end of the scale. They are very tonous, and when you kind of poke them with your finger, you almost can't even get in. You see a little dent in the skin, and the muscle underneath doesn't have any give for you. So, running your hand along, and so you want to, compare one side of the horse to the other, so looking for the symmetry, both in what feels nice and what doesn't feel as nice. And when you run your hand along one side, does it feel the same from that wither pocket all the way along the back? So that uniformity. You'll feel lots of different things, and you'll feel lots of different things between horses as well. And it's going to change with how much muscle mass there is. If a horse doesn't have very much muscle mass, you're actually not so far above the rib shelf, if a horse is really lacking in top line. And so it can feel like they have a really hard top line, but there's actually, you're almost feeling a reflection of bony structures underneath. And if a horse has no top line, it's unlikely that the back is moving nicely and flexing or rotating nicely. So you're not going to have a lot of hydration through that tissue. It often feels very dry. And when you run your finger along, you might get a bit of drag with the skin as opposed to it just slipping nicely. So all of these kinds of things are things that you can pick up in the tissue of the back. And when it comes to function, so what kind of movement is available? One, you'll come back to, as you said, comfort is an observation to make as you do something that's an exercise base. So I'm thinking about a belly lift is one functional observation you can make, which we have an episode on which goes into a lot more depth. But in general, you're making a scratching motion on the underside of the belly, or a gentle curry motion. You don't want to ask too much, but you want to be able to see, is this comfortable for my horse, and is there lift available? This, again, is a reflection of the quality of your horse's back. If you have a horse who has quite a lifted back that doesn't have a wither at the deep angle at the base of the wither, your horse doesn't actually have a huge amount to lift. They're not going to round like a huge arching shape always. So just being able to see how comfortable is my horse, what does the lift look like? When it goes up, is it really jerky or does it have a smooth lift? And when I let go, does it kind of just come back down at the same pace it went up, or does it drop back down? Like someone's dropped a water, when you drop a water balloon, it's sort of all the water rushes to the bottom and it hangs. So those are some pre-work back observations that are very useful.
Yeah, so then if we're looking at them like from a post-work perspective, I'm going to talk about texture and tone and function, and then you can talk about shape and comfort, because that's an area that I really see with Jelly. So for example, I just have a feel through his back before I hop on, and then what I sometimes notice is the left side after riding has more tension in it, and previously too I used to see that, and that he might be a bit more reactive along that side as well. So if you've got a change in texture and tone and then a change in reactivity, also is it one-sided? So do they have the whole side of that back is just tighter, or is it, say, changed in its texture and tone just in the wither pocket, or just at the back of the saddle, or just in the middle of the saddle? Like, where has it actually changed? Because that's going to give you more information about what I need to look at. And are there any kind of lumps, bumps, or hair rubs? Because that could give you some information. So if you constantly get a rub at the back of your saddle, then there's some friction occurring there for some reason. Maybe it's saddle. We'll talk about all the reasons, like going to the things you've got to eliminate. Maybe it's saddle, maybe it's rider, maybe it's the way the horse moves. But just you first going, this changes, this is different before I ride, and then to when I finish riding, that's information. The other aspect with like function with the belly lift, so you've looked at it before the ride, you've gone, yeah, my horse has comfortable belly lift, functional, with and without the saddle, I think is a good point pre-ride. Like, check it before you put the saddle on, and then check it once you put the saddle on before you hop on, because that's going to give you information about their comfort to lift up just with the saddle without you. And then afterwards, so after you take the saddle off, check all the other stuff first, like the shape, the comfort, the texture and tone, and then go to the belly lift and just ask the question, has the belly lift improved? Has it got worse? Like they're more reluctant? Has it got more jerky? Is the whole body different now? Like, say before the ride when you looked at the belly lift, there was a connection to the base of the neck and the pelvis. They were very calm and relaxed, and there seemed to be a whole body connection into that belly lift, which we go into a lot in that belly lift episode. But you might notice, okay, like it still seems to do the belly lift, but it's jerkier, or they're really dropping their head now, or they stood their legs in a weird position now, or they kicked out a leg, swished their tail, their facial expression was different. All of that is information. So the more whole horse observations that you're making with these, the more information that you're getting, because sometimes the difference in texture or the difference could be just the horse's response, but that just happened in the face and you didn't even see anything change in the back, but there was just a different facial expression that you got pre and post ride, and that could be your very first indicator that something is a little bit off. So what about with shape and comfort? What changes might people see post-work with those? We're talking like post-work observations in a negative way, but actually you want to also go, has my horse's back changed in a positive way after riding? Because that's awesome. Like if your belly lift has improved and there's like a better whole horse connection and improved lift, then you've done a great job riding. If your texture and tone feels more like full and bouncy and smoother and and more uniform, well, then you've done a great job riding. Like everything is doing really well there. So don't just look at it from a negative change perspective and picking up problems. Also look at it from like a positive change perspective. And are you creating progress there as well? Sorry.
Yeah, definitely the goal is to serve your horse, to be doing good things for them. So things you could look at again are the same categories. So looking at the outline of the top of the back. So if you look from the side, what does that line of the top of the wither going across the top of the spinous process? So those are the bones in the back. And when you run your hand along the bony part in the center, that's what we mean when we say run them along the dorsal spinous processes. Have a look at the bottom of the wither where there's like the curve where you would see the steepest or sharpest angle. Does it look more or less angular? So sometimes that area can look like it's dipped more, which is hard to believe, but they really do, especially if you've had your abdominals fatigued. You can really look dropped or
fatigued. Or...
Yep. Or if you have a horse who, when you hop on and ride, they put their head up in the air and they go into an extension pattern, where the back dips. And so we want to be looking for it to be less angular, but it's important to notice if it is more angular. You also want to sweep back along the back and feel across the top of those dorsal spines. Is there anywhere now that's gone lumpy or bumpy? Because sometimes that happens. You get a bit of tension and they don't feel as smooth across the top anymore. Then when you come to the roach area, being able to say, has the roach reduced as my horse has warmed up and worked and used themselves? Or has it stayed the same, or has it increased and there's actually more tension and I'm seeing some sort of compensation that's causing more roach? And so just being able to make that assessment, as well as, if you have a look at the shape beside the bones themselves, sometimes it looks as though the tissue has kind of sunk down on either side of the top of the bones, like your saddle has pressed it down and it's kind of reformed in shape and being compressed, and then it doesn't pop back up nice and open like a sponge when you take the saddle off. And so that's, it's becoming dehydrated and compressed in that area, and you're going to you're going to see a difference in shape. So being able to have a look at that and then piece that together with the comfort as you palpate through and say, okay, this is what I see, this is how my horse feels, and as you're saying, the texture and tone, what do I feel underneath my hands as well? So with the comfort, just does my horse have the sensitivity through their back on either side? Sometimes that looks like as well horses that get really twitchy across their shoulders and their back when they've been oversensitized by a saddle that,
in the wither,
like it's rubbing or it's interfering with the shoulder. And so just being able to make an assessment through there of the comfort and also the muscles themselves. Is your horse's muscle, does it look like it's breathing, or is it still just sitting down in that compressed phase? So they're all good observations that you can make. And like Raquel said, you want to acknowledge if it does look better or it looks the same. Then if your baseline is, okay, my horse has a reasonable back, but I want it to improve, then you want to be seeing improvement over time, but definitely making sure that it doesn't get worse. And if you say, okay, this is where my back is and it's good, it's still worth having these skills and checking, because it can change and it can happen quite quickly, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in the back. As you were saying, you've got all of these connections to the rest of the body, and you were talking actually just before about the interference between, a hind leg and a diagonal front leg. The interference of forces traveling up the limbs, across the back, and the rotation, it's coming through the back. So it cops that.
Everything's pretty much going through the back.
Yep. So including your pressure of you on top of them. So all of that counts to being worthy of being checked and staying on top of what your horse's back looks like.
Yeah, and so then say you've created these assessments, so you're assessing your horse's back shape, you've got a routine for how to assess their comfort, the texture and tone, and their function. So you're doing this pre and post riding, and pre and post work. And so you're formulating this picture of your horse's back and how it goes. And then you've noticed something has changed. So then you've got to have a process of elimination, because unfortunately there's not just one thing that's going to change it. So the process of elimination would be, first of all, check your saddle fit and your comfort. So we've got podcasts on saddle fit, and you want to know how to assess basic saddle fit, like how to look at your saddle, not just your saddle on your horse, but how to actually, and we might do some more specific podcasts on that. I think we've done a couple, but just like break it down a bit more for you. But you want to check that. So you want to check your panels. Is there any lights in there? You want to check the balance of your saddle to make sure that it's not looks like it's sitting high at the front or low at the back or high at the back or sitting off to one side, or it's always moving forward or moving back. So you want to have basic skills in assessing that.
Yeah.
Because and sometimes, like, I've seen it where the saddles have been well fitted, and the horse is all changing in a positive way. So we've got like improvements in the back, improvements in the posture, improvements in the biomechanics. And then the back's got to a point where like it's been constantly improving, but it can't, like it's reached the maximal capacity of the saddle. And so then, like, basically if that happens, stop riding your horse, keep working them, get a saddle fitter. Because if you keep going at that point and you've got this positive progress, but then it reaches the the boundaries of that saddle fit, if you keep riding, you'll lose your progress. And I've seen it happen numerous times now where the back's improving, and there's just a tiny little change, and I'm like, you need to get your saddle fit like now before you do much more, because then I've also seen it deteriorate because we couldn't get the saddle fitter quick enough. So, ideally we want that back to keep improving, so we need to keep adjusting the saddle to allow that generally to happen if we've got really good positive progress. So that your back and your observations could pick that up before you've got, you're refitting your saddle to a sore back now. And then the other one is rider function and comfort. We have a massive influence on our horse's back. And last week I was at a clinic and we were really working with the horse's posture, biomechanics, really also focused on the rider and how the rider was utilizing and organizing their body to support the horse's biomechanics. And there was a person riding, and their horse, there was a couple of examples actually, and when Sophie talks about horse function and comfort, I'll give the other example. But from a rider perspective, this lady had had a lovely ride the day before, and then all of a sudden her saddle just kept slipping to the right. And because she was in a saddle that was quite, reflective of how the rider sits, it was showing up this pattern. She'd move it back, kept slipping to the right. So it was a process of elimination. Like, we're looking at the horse. Can we see anything lameness changed in the horse? What we could see in the rider is that her left leg could not lengthen. And so even though the instructor was saying you need to lengthen the left leg, she just couldn't do it. And so, that night, she became more aware of what was going on in her body, and she had stuff going on in her body which had, from the different ways that she was riding, had set up a restriction pattern. So if she keeps riding in that pattern, that's going to create an issue for the horse. Now, we could recognize that because the saddle kept slipping and the day before it wasn't. First thing we did, though, was take off the saddle and check it and make sure it wasn't a saddle problem. And there was no obvious reasons there for it being a saddle problem. But we could see this change in the rider. So it is very difficult when you're the rider, because sometimes you don't realize that your left leg is pulling up, or that you're sitting sideways, or that you're twisting, or you're collapsing. You might recognize I know when my back is sore, that jelly does not go anywhere near as well. So when I'm protecting my back, I may as well be, just have a very simple ride, because he can't lift his back when I'm protecting my back. So knowing what issues you're dealing with, and some people will say to me, oh, like, I can afford to get my horse treated, but I don't get myself treated. And it's like, well, actually, you're doing a disservice to your horse there, because you getting treated is actually going to help your horse too. And you changing your movement patterns and becoming aware of your movement patterns is very important for your horse's comfort. So, number 1, saddle fit. Number 2, look at yourself or video yourself. Getting instructed to watch you ride, even just getting your husband or your friend to watch you ride. They might say, pick up something like, you're always, you're uneven. Your stirrups are uneven. You're leaning, you're twisting, and they might notice it. It doesn't even need to be an expert, just that shift in balance. So they're the first two. What are the next two?
So the next 2 post-work processes of elimination that you are going to go through are going to be making sure that you have a workload that's appropriate to your horse and making sure that your horse has function and comfort. So when it comes to the workload appropriate to the horse, you want to consider things like the surface or the level of engagement. So we've talked a number of times in episodes about the process everything from bringing your horse back into work. You need to go through certain stages, and it's almost like making sure that you have met the requirements of moving on to another part of a stage of riding or engagement. And so if you don't have a certain function, so let's say you are riding a horse who cannot engage through their psoas, maybe, like they just can't engage very well. And then that's always going to be a limiting factor when you come out. And so by process of elimination, if you can go through and say, have somebody who does a functional assessment, and they say, this is an area that's going to always be holding, a pattern of tension, or it's going to be influencing the horse, then your workload is not appropriate to that limiting factor that the horse has going on, and you're going to have it influence your horse's back. So making sure that you're not overdoing the level of work that your horse is conditioned to. So making sure if you're constantly going through a pattern of not really working your horse and then asking them to do too much, they're going to come up against the boundary of fatigue. And once you're fatigued, you don't work in a supportive frame and posture. And so your back is going to take the brunt of the compensation. And so then you might be having back issues show up, and that doesn't necessarily mean that there was an issue with the back. Again, you could have an issue in one particular limb where your horse just doesn't use it very well. It fatigues, and then the brace and reduction in function while they're moving shows up as a back issue. So, making sure that your workload is appropriate to the horse, and then making sure, this is point 4 really, but the function and comfort is there in all the things that you ask them to do as well. So one example is hoof comfort and balance. And so those are 2 things that are always going to affect your spine. So there are so many examples where horses with feet that aren't quite comfortable enough, even if they're horses who sort of get around fine, they have a regular trim cycle with good trimmers, there's something going on where the hoof is not functioning like it should, and so there is a fascial tension being held through every step that they take. And so with all of the connections, you've got coming up the back of the limb through the flexors, into the elbow area, up through the latissimus dorsi, which is a massive sheet of fascia that connects to the entire spine, the entire back, sort of between the wither, coming up towards the lumbar, into the lumbar and towards the lumbar sacral junction. So your hoof comfort is having an immediate effect on your spine, because if you control the movement of that limb, because it's not super functional or comfortable, that force restriction is influencing the back. So all of these things are going to contribute to, going through a process of elimination to say, okay, there are lots of different categories that could influence the back. How am I going to go through them? So here's comfort. And when it comes to balance, if you are unstable, you have to brace. You also just don't have do you have an example of balance?
Yeah. So, for example, if the breakover of the hoof is quite far forward, so they're quite long in the toe, or you don't have a good point of rotation occurring, like a good center of rotation when the hoof is loading and breaking over, then that can make a massive difference to the function of the spine. And I've seen that in a horse where the feet were appropriately trimmed and appeared to be balanced, but there was evidence of mechanical loading on the toe. And then through changing the balance of the feet and bringing back that center of rotation and that breakover point, the spinal motion was insane in the difference in that. And, that's probably another conversation, but we have to recognize the effect of hoof mechanics on the back and the way that a horse can actually use its back. And one of the things, in dissection that I see and a pony I did recently, like I was playing with the hoof capsule and I was literally just like tweaking the motion in the hoof capsule and I could see it up in the wither and the neck, and that's not even loaded. That's not going through any emotion. It was just me moving hoof capsule and me like pushing on the frog and in the back of the heel and how I could see it translating up the limb. So I guess we often get caught up in horses having a sore back. It's a back problem, but recognizing that it could be a discomfort or it could just be a functional biomechanical issue that is affecting loading, which is ending up showing up in the back. So, yeah, did you have some takeaways?
Definitely that creating pre and post checks and knowing what your horse's normal is, both for your horse, but also being able to go and make an observation of a healthy back and maybe an unhealthy back. All of that information is going to contribute to your ability to make observations that will, you might either immediately notice something, like go out tomorrow, make these observations and say, yes, actually, I need to change something about some factor in our riding or in our saddle or our hoof balance means that when I have added my weight and gone for a ride, my horse's back doesn't look as good afterwards. Or being able to say, okay, it actually does look pretty good. And in the future, you're going to notice when things have gone askew. And it definitely allows you to have a more meaningful conversation with professionals if something does change. So your ability to say, like you were saying earlier, my horse's back was fine and now it's not doing so fine. And this is maybe what's changed in the last little while because I understand the timeline that I've had, gives you the ability to say, okay, here's how I can work backwards for elimination for my horse and my situation. And then your professional is also going to have a better starting point to help you out with that.
Yeah. And just remember that, information is also power. And so the more that you know your horse, the more, like Sophie said, you're going to pick it up earlier. And even if you don't know what the cause is yet, at least just making the observation gives you information, so you can just, like, for example, when I ride Jelly in, so there's, I guess, 3 different surfaces. Like I could ride him at home on grass. I can ride him over at the neighbours on kind of a sand arena, or I could take him out for a trail ride. When I take him out for a trail ride, his back when I get back doesn't look as good. I don't feel comfortable in the saddle. My saddle has a flex tree, so it's not super supportive for me on a trail ride. And he also has his head up and it changes the shape of his back during my ride, as opposed to when I'm more focused on biomechanics and he is lifting through his back and, soft and flowy, and I've warmed him up and, I'm really focused on how he's using himself. Like, so you could have situations where it changes. And so it's not every situation, but it's like days when you do jumping, or it's days when you go for a trail ride, or it's days when you ride on a different surface. And so just recognizing that, because maybe it's not that the saddle doesn't fit, it's just that the biomechanics of the horse have changed in those situations, or the tension in you or the horse has changed in those situations. So sometimes it's just that power of recognition and going, okay, well, maybe next time I go for a trail ride, I need to warm up. Maybe next time I go for a trail ride, I need to work on relaxation so his back's not as tired. And maybe I need to really make sure I do my spinal mobilizations at the end of that trail ride, or for me, like put the beamer rug on him so that I leave his back, knowing that his back's not ideal in that situation, like then doing what I can to make sure it gets back to its optimal health and function so that next time I ride, I'm not creating a further issue. So it's just giving you that information and meaning that you can do something before they become a cold-backed horse, a walking horse, a stopping horse, a rushing horse. You know, getting information before the horse is forcing you to look.
And before anyone gets hurt.
100%. And don't forget, we've got episodes on saddle fit, we've got episodes on the belly lift, core function and development. All of those episodes are really useful to complement this one. So yeah, make sure that you've listened to those. And observing paddock postures, even our earlier episodes, observing functional posture. There's lots of other episodes which will support this one. So thank you for joining myself, Dr. Raquel Butler and Sophie Vandenberg in today's podcast. Enjoy your horse time, and please subscribe to the Equine Functional Posture podcast so you don't miss our weekly episode. We'd love a 5-star rating so that we can share more valuable insights, and reach out with any listener requests for topics that you'd like to hear us talk about. And if you're a business aligned with our mission, then reach out to become a sponsor of the podcast.
And we'll see you in the next exciting episode.